the introduction. So hi everyone, my name is Mackenzie Regent. Liz already went over my bio, so I won't go over that again. I'll just say that I wasn't always someone who worked 100 hours a week, so I used to play competitive hockey as well, which was lots of fun. So before we get into the agenda for today, just wanted to touch on who Kaylas is a little bit. So Kaylas LP was founded with the idea of bringing the big bank and big accounting firm expertise down market and making it accessible to small business owners and buyers of small businesses. Kaylas is actually the Greek word for good and was historically used to reference warriors who held themselves to the highest moral standard on the battlefield. And what we mean by that is that we're just here to give you the good independent advice. We're not success based or commissions. We're just here to tell you like it is. So that brings us to our agenda for today. So the first thing we're going to touch on is common pitfalls in mergers and acquisitions and what we're seeing in the transactions landscape. Next, we have 5 tips for a successful deal and what you can do to kind of flip the script to make those things work in your favor. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some questions. So starting off with common pitfalls, one of the things we wanted to highlight is just how many deals end up not eventually closing at the back end. So approximately half of all deals are dying during the due diligence stage. So what's going on here? There's a few different things that are happening, but one of the biggest is just underestimating the deals process altogether. I think, you know, sometimes we see deals announced in the press, or we see the signed sale and purchase agreement, or SPA is the acronym, and we don't really see that that's just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of work that goes into a successful deal. One of the other comments that Damodaran, who is kind of been dubbed the Dean of Valuation and is a professor of finance at New York University, has also talked about how the ecosystem is full of people who feed your addiction. So there's lots of people at the table who only get paid if the deal closes. Banks want to get funds deployed. Depending on who your advisors are, they might just want to see you get the deal done so they can get paid, as opposed to making sure it's a good deal. And that's where making sure you bring independent advice to the table can be really critical. Information asymmetry is one of the ideas that is the hurdle that you have to figure out on a deal, where the seller pretty much knows everything there is to know about their business, and you as the buyer knows very little, relatively speaking. So how do you get up that learning curve in a way that you can feel comfortable getting the deal done? And that's one of the biggest things that buyers have to figure out in these types of transactions. One of the issues with actually getting up that learning curve when it comes to deal asymmetry, though, is that they're in the transactions landscape, particularly in the lower mid-market in Canada, there's what's known as low quality of financial information. So quality of financial information is, you know, do they have clean books? Have they trued up all of their accounting? Do they have the documents that they should have when it comes to a data room? And really, are they showing that they are ready for the transaction and are ready to proceed? And so this is a study that BDC conducted on entrepreneurs in Canada. And the one thing that I'll point out is that 51% of targets weren't considered to have sound financial reporting. So as a buyer, you're often entering into an LOI without having done much due diligence at that standpoint. And then when you're getting into that due diligence stage and really digging through the financials, sometimes it's hard to even conduct due diligence because the financial information isn't there. So now that we've done kind of a quick overview of some of the common pitfalls that we're seeing on transactions, what can we do to make for a successful deal? One of the things I always want to tell buyers when they get into a transaction is defining what the investment thesis really is for this deal. And I'm going to borrow from Simon Sinek here with the idea of starting with why. What is good about this deal? Why are you pursuing it? And that really should act as your North Star of why you're moving forward with this transaction. And as the deal potentially changes and evolves, we should always be looking back to that North Star of, you know what, does this deal still accomplish the strategic agenda or the investment thesis that I started out with? The next item is doing your due diligence. So the analogy we often like to use is that if you were purchasing a home, you would often make that purchase subject to home inspection, and due diligence is really the idea of doing that home inspection on the deal. And so this is really to combat the deal asymmetry and the quality of information. So let's get in there. Let's see if the accounting records stack up to what you were presented in the SIM or the marketing materials that the broker told you, and make sure that really the numbers are matching the story and that everything's good before you would move forward. One of the other items to consider is it's not always just about price. So there's two things to consider here. One is, what qualitative factors have you considered for the deal? Is it was it a strong management team? Had the owner really made themselves redundant? What's the culture of the business? When you buy a business, you're taking the keys to the entire entity. So it's not always just about the numbers. And then the other thing that we really wanted to highlight is that often price and structure go hand in hand. And so sometimes it's worth paying a little bit more in price if you can get the structure that you want. So often people, when they're thinking about what size of business they can buy, they're often thinking about what their ability is to finance, the cash up front and maybe what else the bank can layer on. But you can use things like vendor financing and earnouts to pay out the purchase price over time and allowing you to maybe take on a bigger deal than you thought was possible. So one of the things we wanted to tackle, and one of the big buzzwords in mergers and acquisitions, is the idea of synergies. So let's start with, what actually are synergies? So synergies are the idea that if you're taking one company and another company and you're adding them together, that the total of that is greater than the sum of the parts, and that there's economies to scale in terms of having higher amounts that you're purchasing for your supply chain. Or maybe if company A had 5 accounts payable clerks and company B also had 5, maybe the total entity only needs 7, so you can reduce some headcount. Maybe acquiring is giving you access to a different geography or product line, and it's allowing diversification or maybe vertical integration across the supply chain, and you're cutting out some middlemen in the middle there. So that's really where synergies are based out of. But we do want to kind of point out that in a KPMG study of about 9,000 mergers, even though synergy was the most cited rationale, in 50% of them, there wasn't evidence of any synergies whatsoever. And in a third of them, there's actually evidence of reverse synergies. And so what's the idea of a reverse synergy? So a reverse synergy is the idea that the two companies are actually better off as standalone, because once you combine them, we often see this as revenue cannibalization, where maybe they each had the same customer, and now that you've combined, those two revenue amounts are actually lower than they were on a standalone basis. What this ultimately means is that companies are paying for synergies that didn't exist in the first place. So if you're a business owner looking to grow through acquisition, beware of synergies. And the other comment would be is that normally you want to pay a business owner for the value that they built, not the value that you're going to be bringing to the table. So I'd be careful around the idea of paying on a synergy, because you're bearing all the risk and all the cost of bringing that synergy to fruition. So think about if it really makes sense to give away your upside by paying on some synergies. The last thing we want to chat about here is the idea of knowing when to walk away. So, we tend to be competitive in nature as people, and we often also have the idea of opportunity cost. You've put a year into this deal, you've gotten attached to it, you really just want to see it close. And even though the deal has morphed and changed so much that it's not really what you set out to accomplish, or maybe you're paying more than you thought you would, it gets to that point where this deal no longer makes sense. And nobody likes a dead deal, but it's the lesser evil than actually going forward with a deal that you can never make money on or isn't a good deal for you. So this is where I would point back to that idea of knowing what your North Star and your true why for a transaction is, because if you're clear on that, It'll allow you to better define what your deal breakers are and where you need to decide it's time to walk away. Sometimes what we see is that brokers do a really good job of creating competitive deal tension, bringing multiple buyers to the table, and sometimes people want to, quote unquote, win the deal in that bid type of situation. So it's important to understand going into bids, what is your maximum purchase price? And once it goes beyond that point, being disciplined enough to walk away, realize that there's lots of deal inventory out there and not getting too attached to any particular deal. The running joke in transactions is, you can win the bid but lose the deal. And sometimes you pay too much of a premium up front for the deal ever to be accretive on the back end. So with that, we're going to open the floor to some questions here, and I believe Liz has some prepared.
Thanks, Mackenzie. That was great. So the first question we've got here, you mentioned quality of financial information. So what are some things a buyer can do to figure out quality earlier in a deal? We see a lot of people moving through the stages as they progress and not really kind of seeing those indicators early on and spending more time than they should with an opportunity. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just some high level questions of, what accounting software, ERP software are you using? What's the latest month that you have available? If the latest month they have available is 9-10 months ago, it's starting to go, okay, well, you guys are clearly kind of behind on how you're keeping up your information. And then I would usually ask for just the high level financial statements that they used in the sim, and just double checking that what is in the sim actually even matches what's on their financials, because oftentimes there's a disconnect there.
Right. That's an even a good tip, is just matching that the numbers are accurate. Yeah. That was portrayed. Great. So when it comes to asymmetry of information, how can buyers get up the learning curve?
Yeah, so it's funny because I would actually say that the impetus really should be on the seller. And so in today's market, we're starting to see that with the baby boomers in Canada, BDC has pointed to as many as 72% of business owners looking to leave their business in the next 5 years. And so it's a little bit of a trick question, because as a buyer, I would actually say, here's the information I need to really take a look at this deal and get up that asymmetry. And if you're not prepared, then I'm just going to go on to the next one, and you can reach out to me when you have that ready. That's often what we see really sophisticated buyers doing, is going, you know what, I like the story, I think there's potential here, but here's our list of information we need, and come talk to us when you're ready, as opposed to putting a bunch of time into something where either they're not ready or there's reasons they're not ready, and there's some underlying quality of financial information issues there.
I think that's a great point to be made about, even testing them for a level of seriousness of selling. Like, are they actually motivated to sell? And once you kind of give them that checklist, here's what we want from you, come back when you're ready. If they're going to put it together, that it's an indicator of whether they're ready or not. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So when should buyers bring advisors like lawyers and due diligence professionals to the table? Like, when do they bring them into the conversation?
Yeah. And I get why that sometimes feels like putting the cart before the horse, because one of the great advantages of working with business brokers and others, M&A advisors, is that they don't get paid until the deal's done. So you have no qualms about calling them early on into the process. And then anyone financial due diligence lawyer, kind of fee for service, where the clock starts ticking and there's going to be a fee there. There's always that hesitation of like, when do I want to start that clock? Most advisors, though, would tell you they'd rather you call them sooner than later, because even if it's just a quick half an hour call that us and I know other advisors will just do on a complimentary basis, that might save you 3 months of headache going down the road, where there could have just really been some quick advice up front. So most advisors I know go, the sooner the better. And if it's too early, they'll just tell you that and go, hey, when you get to this stage, now talk to me. But it's generally a good idea to be too early versus too late.
Yeah, we had a lawyer on one day and they said they've seen the legal fees creep up $10,000 to $15,000 because they were brought in too late and they had to go back and fix things and
Yeah,
change things around.
1,000%. And I think with anything, you get what you pay for. So good service providers, even a half an hour of their time, to your point, like you don't have to go back and revise things. And that's even when you can go back and revise things, because sometimes once you've discussed a certain purchase price or term, and that's gone over to the other side, it can be really hard to walk that back because they'll get their heart set on, no, that's the deal I wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Another recommendation that we've made when talking about bringing in advisors is, just put the feelers out and figure out who you want to work with, who you jive with. You're interviewing them, they're interviewing you. But then when you actually have a deal or something that you want to review, they know who you are. Maybe they'll make a little bit more time for you because you have built up a little bit of rapport, and the advisors are busy, and if they already know you, they're that much more willing to take your call if they're having a busy day and get back to you that much quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. And
When
it really just comes back down to that trust that, to your point, starts with rapport. So it's not a bad idea at the same time you're building your deal origination pipeline to be shopping around for advisors, asking them for a discovery call, grabbing a coffee now that things are opening up again with COVID. And have them in your Rolodex so that you're not getting to a point where you actually really need an advisor and you don't kind of have that teed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when time is of the essence, you actually choose the wrong advisor for you just because you need anyone you can get on a dime.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So the next question we have here is synergies is a common buzzword on how to create value on deals, but often doesn't come to fruition. So how do you typically diligence synergies to see if they're real?
Yeah. So my favorite thing about synergies when I see them built out in models is that they'll start on day one after close, as if it takes no time to actually realize them, or they haven't layered in any cost to actually achieve the synergies. And that's just not realistic. So usually at a high level bet check, when did the synergy start? Did they say, okay, it's going to take a year to implement and integrate these companies? Synergies can start in year two. Have they built in, so let's say they've built in a rationalization of headcount. Well, have, one-time severance costs been built in? So it's one of those things around, is there some consistency and realism to what they've built out? When it comes to a due diligence standpoint, we actually have databases that will pull, for this size of company, you need this many AP clerks, average salary is, X, and you can actually do a buildup of what you think you can get to post-close. One of the big ones, which is a little bit out of the financial due diligence depth, is IT diligence. Are the companies running, two different systems? What is it going to take to maybe move one company over to the other system? Does that system even have the bandwidth to handle that many, or do we need to move to a third system altogether? And that's something to really understand when you're moving into this, because tech runs so many different things these days.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I'd like to go a little bit deeper there, Mackenzie,
Sure.
with what you're seeing in technology, because we've seen a trend where, in the due diligence process, technology is taking more of a front seat, and people's use or lack thereof of technology is coming into play as far as price positioning and what someone is willing to pay,
Yeah.
depending on the use of the technology currently existing in the business. Because there could be a really big capital expenditure on technology if it hasn't been implemented, or if they're using different technology to bring over and get both companies on the same tech. So yeah, we'd
Yeah,
love to hear your
absolutely.
insight there.
So this would be similar to in financial due diligence. Part of why we look at quality of financial information is that if you have certain reporting standards that you need to meet post-close, so let's say this company that you're buying has never made it through an audit, but your investors or you would like the company to be able to be auditable after close, you might need to make an investment on the quality of financial information in terms of maybe the business now needs a controller, maybe it needs a different accounting system. What investments do you need to make for that to happen? The same is true on the tech side. And this is really coming down to a basic return on investment of, ooh, maybe we need to redo their website. Their security isn't that great. The systems are kind of archaic and overly manual. And you can look at that and go, okay, that's great actually, because there's low-hanging fruit here of how maybe we can create value arbitrage post-close by addressing these things. But what do we think it's going to cost to do all of that? And similar to quality of information, is that cost just prohibitive, like if they're so far behind? And so there's kind of that sweet spot of there's room for growth here, and maybe they haven't really done much online presence, and so you think that's an easy win to help them make more sales, is developing that. But are they so archaic that it's like, I just don't even want to touch this because that's going to be a lot of work. We are seeing sellers more and more though trying to build in almost a recurring like subscription as a service kind of revenue into their broader suite of services. And we're seeing that helping them increase their multiples, because tech, as you mentioned, is pretty topical. And then anytime you can get into that recurring revenue streams, that tends to help the valuation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, so looking at the different types of buyers. So we work with a number of different types of buyers with Village Wealth. So in terms of the financial buyer, typically the private equity guys and that are looking for that high return, and they search with a different lens. Is there an equivalent of synergies for them to be mindful of?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's kind of financial buyers and strategic buyers. And so strategic buyers have a company, and then A plus B can equal C in their synergies. For a financial buyer, they're not usually synergies. Sometimes maybe they already have a portfolio company where they see a rationale for that. And there are some financial sponsors who will do like a roll-up or consolidation play where they're hoping to realize synergies. But for the most part, these are standalone businesses. And often what we see for the investment thesis for that is an opportunity for high growth scenarios. And so they're really looking for, this company's been here traditionally, but if we bring in our quote unquote smart capital and we do these different things, we can bring it to here. Just like synergies can be a bit of a misnomer and a red herring, the high growth stories can also be. And so it's looking at similar idea of, you're not going to realize all your synergies on day one after close, and there's going to be some costs to actually realize them. The same is true of growth. I think we all have seen, that SIM that shows the hockey stick growth curve, and we've already done all the work to capture this, so like no additional cost needed, and that's just not realistic. There's going to be variable costs that increase as you grow. Networking capital requirements usually increase as you grow. At a certain point, you have to think about capacity. Do they need another plant? Do they need a bigger footprint if they're actually going to hit that growth? So it's not necessarily the case that the growth isn't achievable, but the forecast isn't consistent in that they're really growing top line revenue and kind of nothing beneath that to get to free cash flow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. And so what are some qualitative things that a buyer might want to keep in mind for their deal?
Yes, I think particularly in the lower mid-market space, we like to call it the vacation test. And there's lots of times you're talking to owners and they're like, oh yeah, no, I don't really do much. And then you kind of get into it and it's like, you do all the business development, you own all the customer relationships, like this company falls apart if you're not here. And so it could be a really great buy financially, and there might be lots of growth options there. But if the business walks away with the owner, you're going to just have to rebuild just to get back to what you paid on. So that's something to consider. What's the culture of the business? Particularly a lot of people in the lower mid-market are buying it, but also are planning on operating it as well. So if you're going to be stepping into this business and working with it day to day, do you like the management team that's there? What's the culture look like? How is that fitting? What does the space look like? The next few years, what do things like Ibis World or other resources say are going to be happening to that industry that are just outside of the business's control? And is that something you want to step into as well? So I think in deals, we tend to focus on the numbers, and the numbers are important, but it should be good to kind of peel yourself out of that and just go, is this something I see myself being excited working in day to day? And what am I really stepping and getting myself into here?
Yeah, like speaking of the company culture, like in your opinion, are there pointers that you can look for when you're sort of analyzing company culture? Even sometimes you don't know what the culture is like until you're actually in and you've closed on a deal. What are some things that you can look for in terms of culture?
Yeah, and so a couple comments on that. One is they actually, there are HR firms out there that will do culture assessments.
Oh,
And people can do, it's basically a link in an online survey. Some buyers that I've talked to that have gone through that process feels like that's the people say what they think they should say and not necessarily what's true, even though it's anonymous. So you always kind of have to take those with a grain of salt. They'll also do culture assessments in terms of we're going to take company A and merge it with company B, and what's the cultures of company A and company B, and is that going to work well? And when we talk about, there was a KPMG study that actually said 83% of mergers do not boost shareholder returns. And I think part of that is they're relying on synergies that just didn't really exist in the first place. But the other of that is they just didn't appreciate that company A that's always operated this way and company B that always operated this way. You can't just take those two and put them together and expect that that's going to jive well. And we often see that being the case where they don't. I think part of the difficulty of assessing culture too is there's only so many people under the tent from a confidentiality standpoint. So you can't usually just like walk the halls and be like, hey, I'm looking at buying this. Like, who are you? How's it going? Like, you often don't really meet much of the broader team through the deals process. So I usually try and look at things like what tone from the top is the owner setting? Are there company policies in place, and what did those look like? And even just little things like what upside is there for the employees? Is there an employee stock option pool? Do they get bonuses? Has it been kind of I'm going to hoard everything for myself, or I'm willing to share with my team? Like just trying to pick up from those values from the owner will start to give you a sense of what kind of people work there as well.
kind of like staff appreciation stuff as well.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
yeah. No, that's great. So when does it make sense to use an earnout?
Yeah, so we often get questions of should I be using an earnout or a vendor take back on this, and so I just want to clarify some of the differences here. An earnout is when you want to share the future upside of this business with the past owner, but it's contingent, and so it's really the one, call it mechanism in structure that goes, you know what, you might be worth that, but I'm not paying you on that today. But I appreciate that you've brought enough to the table and the ball is rolling in terms of momentum that you should be able to see some of that. And there's really kind of two instances where we see earnouts at play the most. The first is if the owner's staying on and rolling equity, and you want them to have some skin in the game in terms of performance. So hey, if you're staying on with the business, if we hit X in EBITDA, I'm willing to pay you X much more. And it just makes sure everyone's aligned from that upside perspective. And then the other time we normally see it is if there's just a valuation gap and it's used to bridge that. So we've seen that a lot through COVID, where a seller quite rightfully is going, well, if you're going to pay me on my trailing 12-month results, which are all COVID impacted, then I just don't want to sell to you. I'd rather, keep my business, wait for things to return back to normal, and look to sell at a point where my valuation isn't the lowest it's ever been. But from a buyer standpoint, it's like, well, I appreciate that your business looked a lot different pre-COVID, but I don't know that you're going back to that for sure. And I'm sure as heck not going to pay you on that like it's a certainty. I'm the one taking all the risk here. And so an earnout's been something we've seen a lot through COVID, where the call it certain part of compensation reflects their valuation today. And if and when the business returns back to pre-COVID, then the owner can be compensated for that through an earnout, as opposed to absolutely needing to pay them on that when you're not sure they'll return to those numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so how do you negotiate things like earnouts and VTBs? How are those brought up into conversation?
Yeah, and so this goes back to kind of the idea it's not always just about price. And so one thing we always mention to our clients is that you're not going to win a deal. Good deals are win-win, not win-lose, but you can win on the items that are important to you. And so let's define what those items are, and then let's figure out what a win for them looks like, and then we can create a deal that accomplishes both sides' important points. And one of those items is, are you okay with paying them a bit more in terms of total purchase price if you can actually pay it out of the company's cash flow out over time, which is what a vendor take back is, as opposed to having to come up with all that money up front. So there isn't really a quote unquote right answer here. It comes down to the buyer and what's important to them. But that starts with having proactive discussions up front about what you want this deal to look like, and then talking to the other side about what a win looks like for them, so they feel like you're actually working with them on this. And then you can find kind of concessions on the things you don't care about, and then you can follow that with like, well, here's, we're willing to give you this, but then we want that. And that's usually how we find negotiations work well, is not trying to win the deal, but finding things that you can provide the other side and then asking for what you're wanting in return.
Yeah, that definitely bodes for why bring in the right advisory support, because there's a lot of these structures that can get quite creative and then are tied into the tax planning as well, and without knowing what options are available to you as a buyer, you don't know what you're capable, how capable you are of structuring a unique deal there.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And you bring up an interesting point with tax, because Canadian tax law actually allows the seller to amortize the capital gain over how they receive the proceeds. And so often from a buyer standpoint, you love the idea of a vendor take back, but then the seller might get pushback of like, well, no, I want all my cash up front. And a negotiation tool we've used in the past is going, well, we're in a progressive tax rate system where like every incremental dollar you earn is taxed at a higher rate. Wouldn't you rather have less dollars over more years than have everything hit at once? And talking about the tax planning element to that. So that's where having advisors who can think that through strategically and know how to negotiate that can really add value for a deal.
yeah. So does Kaylas do tax planning as well?
We do, yeah. So we do have a tax side to the business, and one of our partners is in the in-depth tax program for CPA. It really depends on the transaction and what makes sense. Often our buyers aren't really thinking about like the tax side of it, but when we're working with sellers, that's a huge piece of it, because that's one of the biggest things that comes off the top of their purchase price. And the phrase we often hear is, well, how much cash am I actually getting in my jeans? And so there are lots of firms we would recommend from like a really nuanced technical tax standpoint. But if we're running financial due diligence, we need to know enough to know when you need to bring in those types of experts. So we're usually kind of a good first level of identifying when something like that and you need a specialist, and then tapping that specialist as appropriate.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how you kind of said too, the tax advantages are more, on the sell side, but keeping that in mind as a buyer when you're making an offer with the earnout or the VTB, and positioning it to them that way as, I hope you're, consult your tax advisor, because, the way that we're positioning our proposal could be more tax beneficial for you on your end. So be sure to check that out before you.
For sure. Well, and even as a buyer going, you know what, I'm willing to buy your holdco versus your opco and let you do a butterfly reorganization, because for the lifetime capital gains exemption to work, you actually have to hold the shares as an individual. And there's lots of people who hold indirectly through a hold co, and therefore the lifetime capital gains exemption isn't at play. And if they can get their entire capital gains tax exempt, they're probably willing to, take a lower purchase price or work with you on different things. And so just being able to, as you said, Liz, throw these things out there might make it, give them a win, and then you can win on other things on the deal.
Yeah, that's a great conversation to get brought up, or make sure that, that is being had all around. Yeah, neat. So what are some good guidelines for knowing when to walk away? And because sometimes, a lot of our buyers, we hear them getting, they've got rose-colored glasses on and they're so excited about one opportunity. And you'd said it in your presentation too, there's lots of opportunities. There's always more deals on the table. So, knowing and setting those deal breakers up front, and knowing, if this occurs, this is when we're going to walk away, and having that kind of set early on. So what are some guidelines that you can provide for knowing when to walk away?
Yeah, so we typically have 3 that we ask our clients to think about. So one is just purely financial. What's your top line multiple? Like, if in theory, when you're going through, so let's say you put in your bid and you're going to say pay $5 million for the deal, and it was a $1 million EBITDA, and so that implies a 5 times multiple. Usually through the due diligence process, that EBITDA starts to go down. So if that adjusted EBITDA actually looks more like 500,000 versus $1 million, that's an implied 10 times multiple. So, at what point does that break and you go, I'm not willing to pay more than X on the multiple? And that's true of the due diligence process, but that's also true of the bid process. So when you're going through that bid and you get that weird buyer in there that's willing to pay 13 times EBITDA, like, you're not outbidding them and winning the deal. You're putting yourself in kind of an unwinnable position at that point. So that's number one. The second is really understanding what your investment thesis was and what's attractive about this business. There's lots of businesses out there that you can make work from a financial standpoint. So what is it about this particular business that you liked? Was there low-hanging fruit in terms of, they're only in one city and we could easily bring it to other cities, or they don't have that online presence? What's that qualitative aspect there of what you liked about that business? And when you start to dig into it, does that actually stay true? Or, that IP that they said they had doesn't actually work? Or, those types of things as you're digging through it. And then the third is, am I trying too hard on this? And so sometimes we have buyers come back to us and go like, well, you know what, if we only paid them like 5% cash on close and like 50% of it was earnouts, and we did this, that, and the other thing, we could make this work. And I'm like, at a certain point, like, if you're having to bend over backwards to try and find ways to quote unquote make it work, you have to ask yourself the question of, are we better off just going on to the next one at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it should have some degree of ease through it. If there's too much tension there, maybe it's just not meant to be.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question here, because, we often learn so much from mistakes, and sometimes you don't realize that you've made a mistake until, the time has come and passed. So what are some things that you've seen come up for, maybe they weren't clients at the time, or things that were unforeseen before closing? Like, can you give any examples of things that came up as issues after closing that could have been learned from in due diligence? Because it's so hard to, you almost can't predict everything that's going to come up.
Yeah, it's funny. I think some of the things we've seen is just anytime you've kind of taken someone's quote unquote word for something is not usually a good way to do that. So we've seen instances where it's like, oh yeah, no, we've had that client for 10 plus years. I know it's a handshake deal, but they're not going anywhere. And then owner leaves and the client's like, well, my relationship was with the owner, not the business at large, and not you, and so now I'm not continuing on. We've seen instances of owners representing that they're relatively redundant, and then they leave, and it's like, oh, they had the one and only password to the company's LinkedIn site, or, like just things that you don't necessarily think about. And it's like, no,
Right.
they did more than we thought they did. It usually comes down to, if you find yourself thinking, it'll be fine, do what you can during the due diligence process to vet that just as much as possible. What we often see people doing to de-risk this is, one, having the owner stay on for like at least 6 months and letting them kind of transition that for you. I generally recommend making that a consulting agreement as opposed to actual formal employment, because labor law and employment gets a lot messier than just having a contract that you can just kind of say, here's your 30 days notice and bye. Because lots of times, this is another one we see a lot of, is people think like, oh yeah, no, the past owner and I will get along great and we'll see eye to eye and we'll work together for years after. No, we rarely see those relationships last more than about a year. So just bear that in mind. And then the other thing is called reps and warranties, which I'll defer to legal counsel on, but just, it's a good idea to have some things in your agreement where they've had to go on record and say, no, this is true. No, we don't have any pending litigation. I'm not aware of, X, Y, and Z, so that you have some recourse if some of those representations made to you during the due diligence process turn out not to be true.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been great, Mackenzie. Thank you so much for your insight as always. And we're looking forward to getting the content up on Village Wealth. And yeah, with that, we will sign off.